Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So this is going to be part 6 of my user services series. And what I want to show you now is how to build a generic controller. This is one of those kind of holy grail things when it comes to developing for larger applications. One of the things that is a benefit of having a generic controller is that it takes a lot of the logic that you see as very commonplace throughout a traditional controller and boils it down into something that's generic. You see that in most controllers that you follow the same patterns over and over and over. You have CRUD responsibilities, which is create, read, update, delete. And you'll see if we go to my controllers here, so this is our company controller that we developed a few videos ago, and it's fairly simple. It has a company repository that functions here as our ability to work through all of the acquisition and addition of data, so create all those CRUD operations. It has our user context, and as we go down, we can see that the index really doesn't say anything about companies at this point. So that's one of those methods that actually can be brought down into a generic controller. The reason is that at a higher level, I can tell the controller what the generic T is. We've called T as just as an entity before, and T would be in this case company. All right, I can tell it just use T, and I can just change it here and possibly in the company's repository. I can just change it there, and now that allows me to work outside of the bounds of something that's very specific to an area of the database. In this case, this is the company's controller, so naturally it controls companies. So let's go down here. We talked about details. Once again, fairly generic. Nothing here that indicates a company. Create, same thing. Nothing that indicates a company. The only thing, as we get down to create and edit, this is the only time that we actually start thinking about company. Now, the things that we think about when we do company, we start talking about the model state errors that we would naturally encounter, and that's because we're throwing in a company as one of the parameters, and because this is a create, it doesn't have a user, it doesn't have a user ID, and it doesn't have ID. It could have user ID if I had intercepted it at this point and put it in through middleware perhaps, but the way we're handling that user ID is by adding it through our user repository. Further to that, we go down through edit, and once again, it doesn't have anything that indicates company. Going through edit again, similar to the way create works, we don't allow the user to set user and user ID on the front end. That would be dangerous. I could simply just change the user ID from someone else's to mine, and now that company is part of my profile. We don't want people to do that. We want only the logged in user to actually work with this, or better yet, the authenticated user. Now, when we look through here, one of the things that we do is we find the entity on the database, and then we update the entity with new information. Now, this is a very manual process here. So in this way, what we're going to do is, again, intercept some of this code and push it up to a top level controller that would actually handle those nuances. Okay, now there's a few ways to do this, and I'm going to try to do my best to give us the most optimal ways of doing it. This may require 1 or 2 videos. Hopefully it'll only take one. So this nuance here is something we have to bump up a little higher, but the rest pretty much the same. We end up down here with a view, just the same as we've done before. One thing that we will have to do, and this is because when something goes wrong in the model state, let's imagine we have a group of checkboxes that we fill with a data set that says here's the IDs and the title for all those checkboxes. What we have to do is we have to provide provisionings so that I can give it the opportunity to refill those checkboxes if something goes wrong, and then it goes ahead and displays the page again. At the moment, we don't have anything like that, and so naturally it's not something that we naturally think about. But this is going to be something very important as your models grow out and you have more features that get attached to them. Let's move down to delete. So the delete page, now this one here will simply display the delete page, essentially saying, hey, is this right? Do you want to confirm that? And then there would be naturally a delete button on that page. You click delete, and it brings us down into the delete confirm. And once again, there isn't anything here that actually indicates company. This is all boilerplate code that I can very easily move down to another area in a base level controller. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. So let's understand what we have to do first. So this is not complicated. We're just creating a simple controller, but we're going to create an empty controller in this way. The reason I'm using this is because I don't really need to have all of the code recreated for me. So I'm going to call this BaseUserController. Now, you could go deeper and keep asking for, you could have a base controller where you're straight working with the database. That's fine. You can do other things like that, and then layer on user controller on top of that. But for really what we're trying to aim for here, we are building a controller that strictly works with user objects, and that, because it's got to be more secure, is there's going to be some great upside benefit to that. So what does our base user controller need? First of all, as generic arguments. Well, the first thing that I mentioned is going to have a T. Now, I'm calling it T. You could call it T entity. It doesn't make any difference. But what T is a generic that represents that IEntity object, or IUserEntity, excuse me, object that we, in this case, in the case of company's controller, we're referring to company, or even if anything, well, it's really anything that inherits the IUserEntity interface. So let's just throw that in here and make sure that we understand what that means. So T is any class with the IUserEntity. An IUserEntity also requires the TUser, TUser key, and TKey. So we have to add these features as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So if you recall, we have TUser, capital U, and TUser key, and then TKey. TKey is, remember, that's the key type, or the primary key type for our T. So T requires a T user, and it requires a T user key and a T key. All right. So given that, we also have to define what a T user looks like. So let's just put that to the next line. T user is a class, and it has an IEntity and T user key. Okay, so in this case, you recall that the T user would be something akin to application user. Application user doesn't have a reference to user, so it's only an I entity, whereas company T has a reference to a user. That's where we have our user ID and our user navigation property. All right, now we have the I user key. Whoop. Where I user key is an I equitable, and in this case it's an I equitable user key. All right, now finally we have our T key, and that is also an I equitable. Excellent. Okay, so going with that, we have most of the features that we need. One of the things that you may have saw in our company's controller, however, is our repository feature. Now, repository right now is very specific to the implementation of this controller. What I want to do is I want to take this this responsibility and push it down to the lower level so that we can always have access to repository. So in this case, in order to make that happen, I'm going to inject the T repository type in here, and I'm just going to put that just below T. I like to keep these fairly organized. T repository is a class, but it is a class with T base user repository as the interface. As you know, if you've been watching my videos, you know that the user repository has the interface of I base user repository. Okay, then we have T user that we're going to pass down to that. We also have a T user key and T key. All right. So with that, what I can do with that code in company's controller is I can copy this over and paste it. I'm going to put it in the same place. Actually, I'm going to put it just above our index. Now it's complaining because we're still missing a few variables, but that's okay. What I can do here is I can return T repository. Okay, so let's go back over to our companies, and we're going to steal some code from over here. We have our private companies repository. We also have a connection to our user context. We have a constructor that sets up the user context as well, and we also have a set. So I'm going to take all these functions and variables here, and we're going to move them over to our base. So we are not using the company's repository anymore. We're using the T repository. This is also BaseUserController. So now that changes. And then over here, we also have a T queryable. And from here, from our really cool feature that we added to our user context, this repository, now I have a nice generic response to our repository here. Now this is also nullable, so just recall that up here this is also a nullable because at the start it equals nothing, and if we are going to be asking for it every time, I might as well make sure that if it is actually null, which it really shouldn't be, you should be able to get it if you've supplied the correct type of repository. So let's keep moving along here. So in the index action, we'll go back over to companies, and I'm going to pull index now. Now index Looks very easy to port over. There shouldn't be any problems with that. And the only difference that I'm doing here is I'm making it asynchronous. You don't actually have to make this asynchronous, but because my repository is mostly asynchronous functions, I don't like to do the get await or get result or dot result method of accessing the data in this case. I don't think it always works really well, but it's up to you, personal preference if you want to use the async await methods. So at this time, our index works just fine. We have all the features that we need to actually make that work. Let's go back over to companies again. We're going to take some more code. So this details, the only thing that we will make a provision for is details or delete. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. It doesn't exist, so we do want to make sure that we create it. So I'm going to go down and grab that code. So at this point, you may be recognizing that the code that we're pulling in is pretty it's pretty static. Like there's things that that you can already see that don't necessarily need to be up at that top level. Hopefully you're understanding where this makes sense. Now, one thing that you do see here, we have our delete or our details. We have string as our ID type, and you can see down here it's complaining. Well, that's because string is not T key. T key is T key, and it doesn't mean it's a string, an int, or anything. We don't even know what it is. So we're kind of flying blind here. So what we have to do is simply put T key as our parameter type, and now that will go away. All right, let's go back over to companies once again. And now we're going to get into a few things where we're using the HTTP verbs. In this case, it's an HTTP post with an action name of delete. Actually, sorry, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're going to go back up here to create because we just actually finished off at delete or details. So with that, let's move over to create, and we'll just put that directly below details or delete. In this case, there's nothing really special that you have to do. You could make this an async if you want. I'll do that just for the sake of having it consistent, but we don't actually have to do that. All right, let's go back over to companies controller, and we'll move into our post for create. Now this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So we're going to move over this code, and I'm going to start explaining how we're going to manage some of this. Now there's a few things that aren't great. One of them is we have to remove some of these binding features, and that is okay if we're going to do our own validation, which we are. So I'm going to accept that for the time being. What this means is that in the bind attribute, it's saying that when I get a company, the only feature that I want from company is name. All right. If I had a whole bunch of other fields in there, I'd also receive them. But as you can see, some of that as well causes some model state errors, and we're going to deal with that too. So company, as I mentioned before, is just T. Bind, we're going to remove for the time being. And as you advance your base controller, there's a lot of cool things that you can do with those attributes. But at the moment, we're going to just delete them. Now, at this point, what I want to have here is a create for managing model state errors. Model state errors are more specific to the entity themselves. So in this case, I can essentially push those up to the top level controller. So when we have our company's controller that is inheriting this base user controller, company's controller will handle the model state for errors for this. So in order to do that, we're going to create an overridable feature here. And I'm going to make this an asynchronous as well, because you never really know what things are going to need to be done in order for those model state errors to go away. But usually it's pretty straightforward. I'm going to name this based on the action that it's executed from, and model state handler. Okay. And we're going to pass in, at this point it's called company, but I'm going to change that to something more generic. And we're just going to call that model, just to get rid of the idea of company. So we have create model state handler. We need to generate that method. And usually I like them to be directly below where they appear in the where they would actually be handled in the code. This is not going to be private. This is going to be protected, and it's virtual because it needs to be overridable. So in this case, we aren't going to throw any errors, but we actually just don't do anything with it. It's just going to pass through this. So I'm going to comment this out because I am going to come back to this and show you how to actually implement that once we actually bring in the new company controller. So with that, we now have our model state should be valid by this point if in fact there is no problems. If it is a problem, however, I mentioned this too. So here we have create initialize view. So in that way, I'm going to pass in model again. All right, now model is really just there because all we're going to do is we may need to modify what model does. In this method here, what we're going to have to be doing is modifying or adding to the view data or view bag for the view that is going to be populated. And by doing that, we can pass that information up to the view without having a view model. If we need a view model, that's a whole other thing that we can deal with. But right now, we're just simply looking at using the model directly. So the same rules apply here. I am always just looking to have this as an overridable feature. The other thing that I want to do is I want to have a way of intercepting the model before it gets added. And why would I want to do this? Well, there's a few reasons. Generically, there's most of the things that I need to do are handled in that repository. Let's imagine, we're setting the user ID. Let's imagine you have create and edit dates. You can set those at this point as well. You could also have them set in the save changes function. But in this case, what we're doing is we are trying to have an opportunity to make other modifications that might be specific to the model. So let's go ahead and do that. So we create, I call this pre-add handler. Okay, and pre-add handler is going to take a model. We'll generate that one as well. And once again, it is going to be overridable, so it will be protected virtual, and we can remove this error here. Okay, now that we've got our pre-add handler, this is so that we can modify anything in that model before it gets added. all these little features here, you'll find them being used frequently enough in the upper level controllers, but they won't always be required, number one, and they generally shouldn't require a lot of code. What this allows, though, is allows a senior developer to manage that generic model at the bottom, and a junior developer to manage some of the upper level responsibilities. Maybe it's your model state updates. Maybe it's setting specific IDs on an object that may not be set during the repository add. Nonetheless, there are a lot of features for this. Now, finally, one of the things that I often do as well is I have another function that intercepts the model after it's been saved. So here we have post save changes handler, and it's going to be a model that's passed in there again. All right, so once again, this is a overridable function, so we'll give it a protected virtual. So once again, we've got all these great handlers. They all manage some sort of effect as the model is coming through. One of the other things that I often like to do is instead of redirecting it to index, I do like to have it redirecting to the details view of that model, that new model that's been created. So what we can do is we can have it directing to the details. The route values are quite simple. In this case, ID equals model.id. And remember, we have ID available to us because the IUser entity has ID because it inherits from IEntity. All right, so going with that, we're moving ahead quite nicely here. The next step that we want to deal with is the edit functionality in companies. So with that, edit has nothing to do here as well. There's nothing significant about what edit does, but because we're thinking generically, we have to change the key. And one of the things that this does, for example, here is it simply returns it goes through a process of saying, do I have a valid ID? Do I have a valid entity? And that's great. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But one of the things that the reason we really need to do this is because it has to determine whether we have a valid entity and a valid ID, and really just throw errors. Okay, but in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a little bit of code duplication, and I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to move it up to edit, because there will be some points that are different. Okay, we're going to send in the entity to the view. All right, now what I had before is I had this here, create initialize view. All right, the same thing is going to be true for the edit action. All right, so in this case, I called it create initialize view. This time I'm going to call it edit initialize view, and I'm going to pass in entity. So with that, we can just create that method, and we can mark that as protected and virtual. So this is beneficial when we do it like this. We are qualifying whether we have an ID. We're qualifying whether we have a valid entity. If we do, we make modifications as needed to our entity and then display the view as needed. By modifications, that again means that you might be filling data for list boxes or check boxes, things like that. All right, so that's fine there. The next thing that we're going to do is work on the post action for edits. So I'm just going to take all of these little features here. And this is going to be very similar, in fact, to create. All right, so we're not looking to a company, we're looking to an entity. So we can call this model as it's coming through. I like to call the parameter model and the entity the data that's coming from the database. All right, next we have string should be t key. All right, and what else do we have? We don't need the bind anymore. And why is it asking for qualification here? Well, let's just do this. If id not equals, so in other words here, it's going to do a comparison based on t key, and it will say, it'll just double check whether these two are valid, and if they are equal or not equal, then it will return not found. You can see we have some more model state handling to do here, so I'm going to add in our await edit model state handler. Okay, I'm going to pass in the model for anything that we might need to do with the model to make it work, and generate that. So I can easily turn those off for now. If we made it to here and the model state is valid, then we should be okay. If not, we'll go back down to here. We can do edit, initialize view, and pass in the model once more. Now, I will often, when I'm developing my applications, I'll often use a create or edit initialize view. I'm separating the duties right now, but you could easily encapsulate the function just the same and handle the two of them together with one call. Now, over here, we want to do some modifications to our entity, and that can be done by this. Here we can do edit post find handler, and we'll pass in model again, create the method, and here once again we have to make these as protected virtual. Let's just take those, make sure that we haven't missed anything down here. Should probably take away that error. Okay, now, so once again, once it finds the model, or that we have an actual entity here, what we actually have to do is we have to pass the entity down with it. Okay, and model is what's coming in, entity is what's current, so we're going to make the changes that we need to make that work. And so here, entity and model, there we have it. All right, going with that, I could set up a method for post save as well. Seeing as we have that for our create method, why don't we just copy that and move it down below save changes, and that will be called edit post save changes. Okay, and there we have that. All right, so edit post save changes. Now the next thing that we can do here is, as I mentioned here, I like to redirect once I do it, edit or create. I don't like to go back to the details, or sorry, the index all the time. It's a easy way of doing it, but it's not always functionally best. So what I'm going to do here is this, same as I did before. We're going to bring back bring model.id as the ID that's coming back. And we should be okay to work with that. All right, now let's just make sure we've got everything we need wired up for edit. Okay, excellent. Let's go down the list in our delete side. We have delete here, so we can move that over. And that's going to be in here. Once again, just a quick change from the string, and now the delete confirm, which is right down here. And we don't have to change, or we won't lose too much in translation here. Things that we need are fairly consistent. And we're good here. Let's see. Once again, I could move this code someplace. I could have it respond with an error code that or an exception, and I could handle that exception. But for now, we're going to keep it very simple. All right. Now, I can also, if I need to do some actions here for the entity when it's going into delete, for example, let's imagine I have collections that need to be deleted. Let's say, let's imagine a company has a list of employees. If I go ahead and delete company, I also have to delete employees. All right. So in order to do that, you may want to intercept the delete prior to it going in. In other words, you want to tell that you want to set up a list of things to do in the database before delete actually happens. So we say delete pre-delete handler, and we want this to be from passing in the entity, and we can just create that function. It's protected virtual once again. Now you see that I've used virtual several times here. I'm also going to allow these functions, the top level functions, to be virtual as well. There may be cases where I need to override the entire function because it has some very specific requirements. That can happen too. I'll be honest, I haven't seen a lot of times when I've built a well organized generic controller that requires a lot of intervention from that point. All right. Well, it looks to me like we've got everything we need to make our generic repository work. As I go through this, we're going to run a couple tests, but let's give this a try. So we're going to look at our controller here. So let's understand what we need to think about here. I'm going to change this to companies 2, just so that if I have any trouble, I can always go back and I'm not losing companies. All right, so let's add this as a public class, and it will be called companies controller. This is going to be inheriting BaseUserController, and the entity is company. It has a company's repository. The user is application user. Let's gotta spell it right. Application user. Its key is string, and company's key is also a string. Excellent. Okay. So it's telling us that we need to create a constructor here. So let's go ahead and do that. And in this, we should be pretty good to go. It needs the authorize attribute. All right. I think we're ready to go. Now I can test the get functions at the moment. That should handle all of that pretty easily. So we will deal with some of the create and edit functions once we test this out. Okay, let's go to companies, and here we have it. We have our companies displaying exactly the way we expected them to before. I think if I go to delete, or details I should say, I should have all that information functioning exactly the way I expect it. But our edit function does not work, and our create function should also not work, because they will still have those model state errors that we have to override. So let's give this a little bit more code. So what we want to do is override our create, and we want to override create model state handler. Okay, and it doesn't have to return anything, so because it's saying that it's actually a task, we don't have to do that. And it is an async, so that's why it's complaining there. Now, what we have in our create down here, let's go steal this code. This was for the model state handling. And we'll just go back up here, and we can paste that right in without any issues whatsoever. We're not modifying the model at this point, but given that we have a model, we could make some changes as we need, but we don't need to in this case. All right, what else do we need in our model create? I just don't think that we need anything specific here, so let's see. We have this. We can delete that code now because we know that we have that. We have a create pre-add handler. We don't have to do any modifications to our company as it's going through. And at this point, we don't have to do any modifications to our company after it's been saved either. So let's give this a shot. All right, we're here in our companies. Let's do a create new. And we'll just do a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 corporation here. We'll do our create. Looks like we are great going with that. We can go back to the list, and here is our corporation. Now we can't do the edit at this moment. You'll see what happens when we do. It just bounces us back, and essentially what it is that the model state has failed. There should be some validation summary here, but we're not really concerning ourselves about the validation summary at this point. So going back to that, we know that create works. We just now have to modify our model state errors for the error handling. So let's go back over to our companies, and we have edit model state handler, and it'll be very similar, except all we have here is we have to ensure that we just remove those user and user ID. It is going to be an async as well, and that should easily take care of that. Now, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is we've got a little bit of duplication here. If I wanted to, I could very easily do something like this. Just do that, transfer that responsibility down, and that way it's removing the model state for ID and then removing the model state for user and user ID. Once again, if you're encapsulating it, that's fine, but what it does here is makes it a very rigid and tightly bound, which can be good and can be bad. So you have to make a choice around the functionality that you want to extend to the upper level. This is a very common approach that I've found works most of the time. I would say 98% of the time I can make this work without much trouble, and I can successfully pull it off without a hitch. So there's those things, and I think let's just double check what we have in our user controller for create here, we have an initializing view. We don't have anything to initialize at this point, so we're okay there. We're overriding our model state handler, so now we can get rid of those. Yes. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because one of the things that we often run into is people giving us information from, let's say, an API or a call like this where we've got a parameter with an object. That object is coming in. We don't exactly know what's coming in, but we do know that we have specific things on our object that we only want to be set. You generally don't want to just allow any information to come by and just map to that object. That can be problematic. So let's deal with our edit post find handler. Okay. Edit post find handler. Okay, so in this case, the entity, that's the one that's on the database currently, must be updated. So in this case, we're transferring name from model.name. So very easily, that's all we're doing here. We're just transferring name to name. This is something that I want to deal with later on, because I'm often of the feeling that this is something that should be handled by the model itself. In other words, that entity should have an add function. So when I'm adding, what does it need? If I'm updating, what information does it update? Even when I'm deleting and even giving the information, what's the information that I want to give? When I'm giving the information, I may need to have a DTO that would be more effective in giving the view what it actually needs, and not more information than it needs. More information can slow down your view. There's a whole lot of other stresses on the system that make this not workable. But we have it very simply here, and you can see how much smaller this company's controller is by comparison to a large, gigantic one. And now hopefully you're starting to see that if I added more objects to my system, or more entity types, I could have a lot of very small controllers and handle them very efficiently. You'll notice that all the user objects, these things can always be managed in the view state in a very common model as well. So if I always know they're going to be handled in this way, I can just always fix those model states and remove them. So going with that, we're not going to get ahead of ourselves. Let's just make sure that our edit actually still works. Okay, we're back in our companies page. Let's see if we can perform that edit that we talked about. We'll add a 6 at the end, press enter, and we now have an edit function that functions the way we expected. Let's just throw that back down to 1 for example, and that works just fine. We get it back in our index. Everything should be good there. Details works, delete works, and let's just confirm whether we can actually delete it. I think we can. And we can, yeah. Nothing that needed to be changed in delete because there was no overrides that were required in that respect. But as again, if you have collections or other navigation properties on that object that required being deleted prior to the whole object being deleted, you'll want to handle it in that pre-delete handler. Okay. Awesome. All right, so that gives us this really great base user controller. This one allows for a lot more flexibility in your applications. The one thing before I let you go is you'll notice this thing right up here. This is really long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify this, because remember, our base user controller should be able to be used through any application that we built. save the use of course, the data context, but that's for another story. We're using our IUser context for this to avoid having a tightly bound relationship with the application DB. So how do we narrow down this and make it more specific to our application? Well, this is pretty cool and super simple. We call this BaseUserController, and it's going to take pretty much all the same features here, but I'm going to do this. And we do not want to be calling in these features every time because we already know what they're for. Take away these, and we'll replace TUser and TKey with the entity models that we use. And that's string, actually, sorry, I'm losing out on my path here. And we have T repository, I'm getting too excited. And there we have it. Okay, so we take that, and this one here for T user entity is just like that as well. And we push it down there. Fantastic. All right, and the last thing that we do here is just wire up the constructor. Whoops, we have one more thing to fix here with our T key, and now we have this awesome feature for our BaseUserController. That, one more time, just allows us to simplify this implementation down to BaseUserController. We'll test this one more time here. Fantastic. So our new implementation of BaseUserController works just fine. And you can rename that as you see fit. You may want to call it user controller. We can very easily do that so that it's not that we do recognize that it's not the base user controller anymore. You may even consider doing creating abstracts as these classes as well, so that they're not inherently creatable by themselves. Okay, well, that's it today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. These generic classes are super useful for a lot of the things that you do in programming. I hope you enjoy it. If you have questions, comments, please put it into the comments section. I'm always happy to respond when I can. Keep coding. I love you all. Thanks very much. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.